Welcome to Culmination, where we're not experts, but we sure have a lot to say. In the process of becoming our best self, I have with me the history buff, Nikita Khaykin, to discuss consequences. And with that said, let's get started. So, Nikita, let's just define this first. What are consequences?
Well, consequences are results of your actions or somebody else's actions. It's basically the aftermath of something that happens. That's how I define it.
Okay, so they're just outcomes, results.
Well, yeah.
How do they happen exactly?
Well, in a plethora of ways. Consequences are it's a very general word. When we think of consequences, it's usually in a bad context where, you you do something bad, your consequences you can't play outside tomorrow.
Right.
But a consequence, a reward is actually a kind of consequence. You
Yeah.
did your homework, you get to go out to a fancy restaurant with your family tonight.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very broad term.
I like that you said that essentially its connotation is usually negative. Like, do this or else you'll face the consequences. It's just a big, scary word, but really it's just kind of outcomes in general. And we can talk a little bit about punishments and rewards. So, do you want to just get into that? Because what I usually think of when I think about those two things is operant conditioning, which is essentially it's a form of conditioning someone to do something based on rewarding them or punishing them for their behavior.
Yeah, so, well, for those that don't know, operant conditioning is basically the carrot and the stick. And there's basically 4 ways to use the carrot and the stick. You can give somebody the carrot or take away the carrot. That's a way. And then you can use the stick or you can stop using the stick. Those are basically the 4 ways you can use operant conditioning. And this was actually, this was the 60s, I believe. B.F. Skinner took a baby and he would hit a metal pole, which would have been obviously really loud, and the baby would cry and really not like that sound when he did that.
That's an understatement.
Yeah. And so when the baby would do something bad, like reach for the wrong block, or I think actually rats.
Yeah, it was a white
condition.
rat.
Yeah, he would condition the baby to not, to fear the rat, basically, even though it wasn't really doing anything to him. So whenever he saw the rat, he would immediately begin to cry eventually, like not even without the sound, without anything, without the rat doing anything to him. He would just begin to cry at the sight of the rat. And
right.
And obviously, since there weren't any ethics to speak of back then, really, he didn't uncondition the baby. He didn't really deal with any of the consequences that came with that experiment.
Right. And if you think about that, because we're talking about consequences here, think about just the magnitude of a consequence like that. Like, I believe that was the baby Albert experiment.
Yeah.
And I think the kid died, like, not so long after. And if you think about just the consequence, like, there were no ethics back then. Like, now if you try to do an experiment, you have to get all these debriefs and basically everything to make sure that your volunteers aren't scarred or hurt in any way.
Yeah.
But that, because of these procedures we have today and ethical guidelines, I wonder if that's a consequence of these frankly interesting but horrible experiments of the past.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, there's a lot of, it's very difficult to say, like when you had these unethical experiments, you basically took everything to the most extreme form that you could to get what you thought were the best results. I mean, where you could condition an adult to, fear a rat eventually, but that's much harder. And to an extent, there's the phenomenon where you act differently when somebody's watching. So
that's the Hawthorn effect, right?
Yeah, so something like that. So when but with the baby, it doesn't really it doesn't really have those, the Hawthorn effect, for example. It doesn't really care if it's being watched. So at that point, it's basically an uninhibited experiment. But with that come the consequences. Nowadays, you can get similar results, but you kind of have to, trick the people being experimented on in a way where, you would have you basically tell the people that they're being tested for one thing when you're actually testing another, where it could be, we're testing, you ask them, like, we're testing basically who runs the fastest, but then it's some kind of obstacle course where people fall a lot, and they're trying to test human nature, like how many people are going to help those that fall versus how many are just going to finish the race, something like that.
Who's going to win the next season of Wipeout?
Yeah.
Got to build the alpha dog.
Yeah.
So let's tread back a little bit to just thinking about the consequences. Like, we have these ethical guidelines and basically just a safer way of doing experiments, and really things in general now, because of we didn't really have these limitations of the past. So let's talk about this. How is the present, in a sense, like the present that we live in, our lives currently, me talking to you now, a consequence of the past? Like, how is our entire present just a consequence?
Well, there's the famous cliche, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. But even in cases where, we take as people not learning about something, where, we think that people refuse to take lessons to heart, even in those cases, it's very difficult to say that people didn't learn, even when, the outcomes make it seem like it did. A very good example of this is, the transition from World War I to World War II. I mean, World War I was this huge conflict, the biggest in history to that point, where we basically think that, Britain and France were basically just sitting on their laurels. They weren't doing anything to prepare for the next war because, World War I was dubbed the war to end all wars. To an extent, they actually believed that. But in reality,
did they have a right to do so, though?
Well, that's part of the question. Is it really fair to, I won, therefore I'm the best? It's kind of like playing 3 rounds of rock, paper, scissors, winning every single one, and then just, declaring that you're the best, and then you'll never play rock, paper, scissors because you have a 100% win rate. Well, is that really fair?
But could they have truly predicted that Germany was going to advance to war? They didn't know that.
Well, not necessarily, but the fact is that they left Germany. I don't want to sound like one of those people, but they effectively left many of the German people with the impression that they had no other choice. They put them at the very bottom of the pit, and there was no way to go but up. Obviously this wasn't true, and after the initial years of instability, things like the U.S. assistance for the Weimar government, you ended hyperinflation, you basically had a boom period right before the Great Depression in Germany. It was seen like, Germany can recover from this, but that's not what many of the German people believed.
Right.
There was a famous quote, I believe it was a French general. He said, this is not a lasting peace. This is a truce for 20 years after the Treaty of Versailles, which is,
that's
scarily
scary.
correct. Yeah, 1919, 1939.
That's exactly the time frame.
Yeah. I mean, whether it's not really fair to say that people like him, I'm sorry, I can't remember who this general was. People who it's not fair to say like, oh look, this person already thought that he knew about Hitler. No, he didn't. He didn't know any of this. He was not necessarily taking a shot in the dark, but he was making an educated guess. The thing with educated guesses is they're still guesses. And the fact is, you can't really build statecraft off the opinion of one general, especially while you have, your entire top brass saying the exact opposite.
Right.
So they weren't necessarily building a peace with the Treaty of Versailles, or at least they thought they were to an extent, but that wasn't necessarily their priority, especially for the French. It was revenge and bringing some sense of stability to their country, which had been ravaged by war, even more than Germany had. It wasn't their priority to make sure that the peace would last 30 years instead of 20 or something like that.
Yeah, and it's just interesting how these consequences aren't universal in a sense. Like World War I happened. This is a true variable that everybody knows about. It's true. It's objective. But like right after that, everything else is subjective. Like who was the winner? Who truly lost? What was the cost? Like
who was to blame?
Yeah, who was to blame?
Yeah. World War I is the culmination of many factors. It's not it's not solely Germany's fault because, Serbians shot the Archduke, Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia was, first to mobilize after Austria.
Because they were allied with Serbia, and then Germany
Yeah.
was allied with Austria, and then France was allied with
yeah.
Russia, who's allied with Serbia. And
If I had to assign blame to one country, it would be Germany because of the blank check that they gave to Austria, where, we unconditionally support you, and no matter what you do against Serbia, which happened shortly after the assassination.
That's a good point. Moving on a little bit. All of these events of the past influence our today. Like the League of Nations was created in 1919, and although that flopped, it was kind of the predecessor to the UN. And then, just because of World War I, World War II happened, and then because of World War II, a lot of the countries mobilized, and there's also like the Russian Revolution of 1917, which created the Soviet Union, and then America was becoming a very prominent nation. So then you had the Cold War for years until the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. And it's just interesting because you think about 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. I mean, I know the Berlin Wall and everything was collapsed in 89, but you think about history, and because history is a story, it's like you almost think that after these events end, that's it. But it keeps going.
Yeah. I think this is one of the things history teachers sort of fail to get across, that history is continuous. It's not necessarily like math where, you wrapped up this problem, okay, moving on to the next one. It's kind of like those English questions where you have to keep reusing the passage, except this might be the Protestant Reformation in 1870, 1519, and then this leads to the Troubles in Ireland, where, well, at least inadvertently, where you had part of the conflict was between Protestant and Catholic Irish people in Northern Ireland, which, it was partly due to nationalism, but ultimately you had this partly religious conflict. So you're tying in basically what an event that happened very recently. This only ended in, I think, 1990, 1991, something like that. But you're able to tie this into an event that happened 400 years ago, more than that,
Right, yeah. And think about like I'm not going to get too into this. I'm just going to mention it and then get out. But like think about the Palestinian Israeli conflict. Like just that was created in the late 40s because of like British meddling, and that's still a conflict going on today. It was never really resolved.
Yeah. And this conflict, it's just part of the trend of, again, the artificial boundaries that, were kind of drawn. I think the best example of this is India, where you had basically, there's one area, it's Punjab. Basically, you gave Pakistan part of Punjab, and you gave India the other part. But you had the, ethnically homogenous people divided right down the middle. It's kind of like, again, North and South Korea divided along the 38th parallel. Geographically, I guess it makes sense. Along the latitude line, but you're dividing families in half. You're dividing, the country in half, when in the 50s there was nothing, just about nothing separating North and South Korea, but beyond, geography.
Right.
Yeah.
Just
And
all these
this
consequences.
leads to, mass exodus, religious conflicts, things we can still see today based off arbitrary decisions that happened 50 or 150 years ago. Yeah.
So that's some great stuff. Yeah, I just want to transition though to kind of talking about, like, we've talked a lot about history, and it's just interesting how our current world is just a consequence of the past, and it exists on the micro scale too, like our individual lives. So I just kind of want to focus on that a little bit, and then we'll look at the future and everything. But just real quick, how think about like the micro scale, like maybe your life specifically, like how your present is a result of past consequences, good and bad, that made you who you are today.
Well, a very convenient example right now. I have AirPods, but about a year ago, I accidentally left them to go through the washing cycle. So the microphone on them doesn't work very well. So I basically have to yell so someone can hear me through them. So as a consequence, I'm having to hold my phone up to my head, basically making a call, talking to you right now. So, I mean, there's a lot of small things like that, but there's also, larger things where, between 8th and 9th grade, I transitioned to accelerated math. I took algebra over the summer. But the fact is that math has definitely been the most stressful thing for me in high school. I used to be pretty good at math when it was, simple, even into algebra, but once it got to geometry and calculus, I kind of really fell behind, and at least, freshman and sophomore year, I wasn't really willing to put in the effort to catch up. But, so was it a mistake? I don't know. But the fact is, it influenced, my friend group, my academics, my GPA, now my college decisions,
Yeah.
But it's, you're left questioning, was this a good choice? You say, well, I'm stressed right now. I have a math test tomorrow, for example. Maybe I don't think this was a good choice. I shouldn't have done this. But, I had a really good time with my friends 2 days ago. That was really fun. I might not have had these friends if I, stayed in honors or math or something like that.
Yeah.
So you're kind of left wondering, and you never really know the answer. But the fact is, regardless of what the truth is, or what would have been, the fact is it wasn't, and you're dealing with the consequences of the decision you made, whether they're good or bad.
I'm really glad you said all that. Yes, that's some good stuff. Because it's just like the big idea here is the butterfly effect, how everything goes into everything to bring you to where you are.
Yeah.
And personally, I like to when I think about regret, I think about it in two ways. One way is like the grand scale, and then the other way is just like a minuscule regret. So like the minuscule is just, oh, I regret not saying goodbye to my friend when I left work the other day. Like just something that's like a quick regret. Yeah, I feel bad, but like okay.
Yeah. I talked a little loud to my parents that time. They might have taken that the wrong way.
Right.
I regret that. I'll say sorry this afternoon. I don't know.
Yeah, and it's like you regret it because you
Because
created a consequence that is
yeah,
uncertain.
yeah. In
Did
this
it
case,
hurt
it's
them or not?
yeah.
Uh,
These smaller cases, it's not all that relevant to either your present or your future. But the only way to scale from this point is up. You
right,
get bigger consequences. Was I condescending to that teacher? You know, does that teacher hate me because of the way I was as a freshman? Now I have them as my teacher as a junior. There's consequences to
right.
yeah, and that's a medium consequence. But you could have been a jerk to some guy in college, and now he's basically the manager conducting your interview.
I mean, that joke exists for a reason. Be careful
Yeah,
who you bully in high school.
yeah, that's definitely an aspect to consider.
And what's
You're
interesting is, in a sense, I think the way I view it is consequences are, well, for one, they're inevitable to happen,
mhm,
good or bad. But
yeah,
also, they're essentially permanent unless you adapt.
hmm
So, like, you said you yelled at your parents. They will always be mad at you until you fess up or until something changes, whether it's you changing something or they have a change of heart or just view something differently. There needs to be some change, otherwise it will permanently be a consequence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. It's just that, as we were talking about in particular the smaller consequences, they might not haunt you. Whereas, you know, maybe if you yelled at your parents, yeah, they're probably going to stay mad at you for a really long time if you don't do something about it. But,
Right.
if you just talked in the wrong tone because you were grumpy in the morning, I mean, that's another case. They'll probably forgive you within the day, if not by tomorrow. You know,
Mhm.
a lot of these consequences are lasting, and you do have to do something about it to fix it. But at least on the smaller scale, they will resolve themselves with time.
Right. And back to what I was saying about regret. So that's like the small regret. But
Hmm.
when it comes to the grand scale, I would say that I don't regret anything. Because if you think
Mm.
about it like this, like you've probably seen memes about it or just have experienced it yourself where you're lying in bed at night and it's 3 a.m. and you can't sleep
Uh-huh.
because of that thing you did when you were 5 years old.
Yeah.
And, it's just like every bad thing that I've done and that you've done and that my other guests have done and that other people that I know have done. Like everyone's done some really sleazy things. I mean, some
Hmm.
more than others,
Yeah.
some with more magnitude than others, some less, but
Yeah.
everyone's done something they're not proud of. And the way I view it is I don't regret them because I try to learn from it. But that's an important thing to note. I would regret them and I should regret them if I don't do anything to change. But because I do try to better myself and try to make things right over time with, like getting closure or just fixing myself so I don't repeat the past, like you said at the beginning.
Hmm.
Um, Really, just why should I regret things? Because of these things, I'm who I am now. Like because I did these horrible or sleazy things to somebody, because I did those things, now I have experience. Now I can literally move on and say, I will never let this happen again. And I probably would have done that worse in the future if I didn't have that experience.
Yeah, that's true. And then with these events too, you also have the aspect, what would have happened if you didn't do this thing that you think was, embarrassing? If you hadn't told that that I don't know, inappropriate joke in 7th grade,
Yeah.
that the teacher yelled at you for, would you have made that friend? Would you have had the same perception among your classmates as, somebody who's not stuck up, or somebody who you can talk to? You
Right.
know, it's the alternate history aspect that you can't really predict. I mean, maybe if you hadn't I don't know, hadn't had that argument with your friend, then you would have, like you said, it would have just happened later and been much worse. That could have ended your friendship instead of being like a hurdle that lasts for, a few days.
Right.
Yeah. It's very hard to foresee these things, but especially, as you said, uh, the meme where it's, you did when you were 5. At this point, the consequences are either so inconsequential that it doesn't matter, or so massive that they define your life. It's
Yeah.
very pointless to be looking back at things, especially that far. And even, when we're 40, we'll be looking at, oh, I chose to go to Ohio State University and not, some Ivy League. Okay, that defines you, but the fact is that, you getting your 10th job, it's impacted a lot less by where you went to school than it is, what your last job was or how you did at that job.
That's a good point.
Yeah. I mean, it's sad that college gets you your first job, and that job, it usually sets the trend from your for your career. It's a very high correlation, but the fact is that correlation is not causation.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that, you got into a very good university and you went there doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to be a really good employee. But on
Yeah.
the other hand, it does mean that you're probably going to be a better employee than average, at least. So,
It's also all about your mindset.
yeah, yeah,
Like, am I gonna work hard in college, but then as soon as I secure my job, it's like, well, I did it. I beat the game.
yeah,
Now I don't care anymore.
yeah. You know, are you going to fight to advance your career? You know, if you're introduced to a firm after having attended, a state school or something like that, where you're basically at a lower position where you than you would have been, um, you're kind of just, at that point you're more driven actually to, advance yourself, because you say, oh, I'm a junior analyst at some firm. This isn't what I want to be. I want to be, a vice president. I want to be a chief financial officer. I want to be even a CEO. I don't want to be here.
Mm.
Whereas if you went to Harvard and you're at a firm, you're kind of say, "Hmm, you know, I'm kind of satisfied with where I am. I'm already making 6 figures.
Right.
I don't really want anything else, so I'm just gonna stick around here. Maybe I'll be, the senior version of my current position, by mid or late career. But regardless, I'm just gonna, sit back and enjoy where I am. Putting enough effort not to get fired, but not really fighting for myself, because I don't care. I'm fine with
Right.
where I am.
And I think that makes me think about Monsters University. Have you seen that movie?
Yes, I have.
I know it's weird because it kind of gets a bad rap sometimes, and it's not the original, and it's a really weird prequel. like did we
It's weird. I mean, I like it.
Yeah, but the
Yeah.
ending is probably one of my favorite endings of any movie. Like,
Mm.
you know,
Oh
they
yeah.
The whole movie, here, let me just explain it. The whole movie is these two, the two guys, Mike and Sully. They want to become professional scarers. That's their dream. But they end up, throughout the movie, they try really hard, but, spoilers, by the way. It ends with them getting kicked out of college, and their dream is basically soiled. And that was a consequence of basically every action that took place in the movie. But instead of giving up, they noticed they have to face the consequences. But at the very end, Mike's like, they're still hiring at Monsters, Inc. But, as a janitor. And they're like,
mailroom, I think.
Yeah, mailroom.
Yeah.
Forgot about that. Yeah, so then when the credits roll, they show a montage of all the different jobs that they took before they ended up becoming scarers in Monsters, Inc.
They basically work their way up the local corporate ladder, where they're going from low position to slightly higher position to mid-range position to eventually they get to what I imagine is about the highest position you can have.
Right, and they really cared about every step along the way, because as you notice, and it shows the montage through pictures in a locker, it says they have awards in there, like best janitor of the month or something. They didn't just do these things to move up the ladder. They actually really cared about it. And that attitude and the fact that they pursued these smaller jobs that might not have as the same of status, that guaranteed a better consequence for them.
And even though they had a certain, they had a very large setback, which was, getting kicked out of college, basically. That they thought, or at least, they thought for a certain time that, this was the end, maybe I'll be able to do something, be able to, do my part, where I imagine when they first said that they're hiring, they would have thought that, they would have become some kind of assistant to the scarers at the best, or they would have stayed janitors, but they get to interact with, the scarers, their idols. But, basically they put in the work and they got out what they really wanted, Yeah.
They had a dream.
Yeah, they just put in the work in a different way. It wasn't finishing college, it was, putting in work in lower positions.
Right. So that brings me to the next big point that I want to talk about. So we've talked about how the present is a consequence of the past. But also let's discuss how the present is altered by the idea of the future.
Okay, yeah.
So, and this example leads right into it, because the consequences of the past created their situation of you're kicked out of college, you lost everything, basically now what? I have nothing. But they took the mail job, and basically this goes along with it perfectly. Their present, the current moment in their lives was, all right, I'm going to join the mailroom and we're just going to do this. But every moment of the present is impacted by the future, because you want to act proactively to create better consequences and avoid the negative ones.
When they started working in the mailroom, it wasn't under the perception that, we're going to be working in the mailroom for the rest of our lives. So, at that point, they would have, put in the least amount of work possible, but just enough not to get fired. But they had the future in mind, that we're going to maybe become scarers, or at least have some kind of position, comparable. We're going to go as high as we can, basically.
Yeah.
So they have to put in the work, because they know if, they're substandard or standard employees at the mailroom, they're not going to get anywhere, at least not to where they want to.
Yeah. And give me some other examples of how your present, your current day, is just impacted by your future ambitions.
Well, it's second semester senior year, and most people are letting go right now. But I think my current, or at least part of my current strategy is I'm likely going to attend a state school, even though I've gotten into some of the more elite ones. I still haven't heard back from, my top choices. So if I don't get in, I was thinking of going to a state school and then transferring to, my dream school after 2 years. But at that point, you basically want to have the best grades possible in, junior and senior year, as well as your first 2 years of college.
Right.
So basically, I'm going to have to put in the work now and in the next 2 years. And at that point, I'll probably have a solid, an even better chance of getting into college. Like I'm handicapped by my past at this point as well. Or I mentioned earlier, I wasn't really putting in the work in freshman or sophomore year. More so freshman year, but even in sophomore year, I wasn't really putting in the work. By junior year, I had achieved straight A's besides math, which was, pretty big. And then this year, I just have straight A's all out. But meanwhile, freshman and sophomore year, I had not quite a 50-50 mix of A's and B's, but, pretty close.
But it's okay because even though the past has put you in a, it's handicapped you, like you said, you can't go back and change it. And whether you like it or not, you're just in this situation. So why not think about the good you've done and move forward anyway?
Yeah. Capitalize on what you can do or what you will do for the sake of the future. You can counteract your mistakes. I mean, a lot of people who are in bad situations don't really see a way out, but that's, sometimes their points are more valid than at other times. But it's largely because they see that, oh, I made this huge mistake and I can't undo it. That's true, but you can compensate for it. You can move past it, basically. You can do something about it, even if you can't undo the past or the mistake.
Yeah, and you can alter yourself to a point where you can prevent others from making the same mistake, or from yourself from making the same mistake.
Yeah. It's like we were talking about earlier. It can be more beneficial to make the mistake right now when the stakes are lower than, make it later, but in a worse way when it matters more. If you can make it now and learn from it, making that mistake might actually be beneficial.
Right. But even still, even when the stakes are quote unquote higher when you're older, which is true, but you don't need to think of it like the end. Like even at your worst moment where it's rock bottom, like you're crippled by student loans and everything else, like there's always something you can do.
Yeah.
Like it might feel like this is it, like this is the end. But there's just always something. There's always an alternative.
There's always a light at the end of the tunnel, even if it's not, the light or the outcome that you wanted. I mean, if somebody wanted to become a military fighter pilot, I mean, and then they, don't have the vision for it, I guess, but they still have pretty good vision. They could become an airline pilot. They could become, at that point, that might not necessarily be what they wanted, but the fact is that they're doing very similar things.
Right.
And they can be happy that way, whether that's, becoming a military pilot, an airline pilot, or joining the military and being part of the Air Force in another way, as an air traffic controller, as a ground crew, maintenance of the planes. Whatever if they like planes, like fighter jets, They can become the maintenance. If they like flying, they can become the airline pilot. You kind of have to adapt to get what it is you want, even if you fail at first, to get everything that you want.
Yeah. But also you have to consider that even when negative consequences do strike, these consequences, like we kind of theorized earlier, they're basically permanent unless you do something about it. So if you do nothing about it and you just sit in your sorrow, basically, like you can't really get out of that. You have to take steps.
Mm-hmm.
And we're saying that there's like alternatives and you can take steps, but you at least have to take steps. So I just kind of wanted to throw that in because it's an important distinction. It's not like the light is just at the end of the tunnel, but you have to get up in the darkness. Like you can't just lie down. You have to actively search for the light.
Yeah. It's you kind of have to
It's a hard
make sure you keep seeing the light.
Yeah.
Even if the color of that light changes, you just have to keep the end in mind if you want to get past somewhere that you are right now.
Yeah. So yeah, and back to how you were saying that like your present is impacted by your future ambitions. You were talking a lot about college, but go deeper than that. It's like even college is like the next step consequence.
Yeah.
Like what about after college? Why are you going to college? That's the better question.
Okay. Is that a question to me or a
Yeah,
general question?
you.
Oh. Well,
You'll be the representative for the viewer.
all right. Well, I really like history, but I don't like the jobs that historians have, which uh, generally involves a lot of writing, generally involves a lot of implementing sources to drive a narrative or a conclusion. I'm not really a big fan of that kind of work. I mean, I love history, listening to it, understanding it, everything, but that's not really what I want to do with my life.
Yeah.
So I want to go into business. Where exactly, I don't know. Um, probably something like, finance or management, something like that.
Mhm.
It plays to a lot of my strengths, which are, I've usually been able to find some pretty creative solutions to problems in the
Yeah.
past. And also, working in small groups, I'm usually very good at, and memorizing things that I find interesting, at least.
Mhm.
It's difficult for me to memorize math formulas because I don't really find them interesting. I don't, you know, I don't, I'm not passionate about that. But when it comes to memorizing, historical events, that's a different story. So, yeah, basically, to get a good job in business off the bat, you usually need to attend a very good college. Um, so, I mean, I applied to my dream school, which is UPenn, and also Duke, which are very good colleges.
Mhm.
And from there, I imagine I'll probably be able to get such a job, off the bat. But if I was to go to, Ohio State, it's possible, definitely, that I could get a job like that. But it's, I'd have to be probably at the top of my class. And with that, I'd need, a good dose of luck, for lack of a better word. So,
Although, you know what? That's a good point.
yeah.
You said luck. How does luck fall into consequences?
Well, it's kind of ironic that I don't necessarily believe in luck, but
Mhm.
like I said, for lack of a better word, I don't believe in lucky people or unlucky people. Like somebody just wins the lottery a whole bunch of times. I mean,
Yeah.
that's, I mean, for lack of a better word, that's lucky. But the fact is that I don't believe that that person is inherently lucky.
Yeah.
Maybe they're just, the chances, it just keeps happening to them, which, the chances are basically zero of them winning the lottery at all, let alone multiple times. But the fact is that I just can't believe that they're winning it because they're a lucky person.
Mm-hmm.
So I say luck, for lack of a better word. It's kind of more like chance, where basically, maybe I'm introduced to somebody. Maybe I get a close relationship with one of the professors, who
Mm-hmm.
introduces me to some kind of executive at PNG, and they take me on as an intern, and they really like
Yeah.
the way I work, and then they hire me, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So where otherwise, the kid who graduated from Harvard would have had a huge advantage over me, who graduated from Ohio State. But at that point, they would know I'm a safe bet as well. That I can do the work. I'm valuable. I can do it. They actually have experience with me, which would lead them to actually prefer me as well.
What's also interesting about luck? Like, how you said you don't believe in lucky people and everything.
Mm-hmm.
There's most people argue that, like, basically being alive is like winning the lottery. Like, with the slim chance that having your life is, like, it's just so slim. And then you have to consider predisposition. Like, we were born in America, for an example, like, just in a certain family with a certain status. Like, that is all, like, people would mostly consider that to be luck.
Mm-hmm.
But I heard this really interesting take from one of my friends who has a lot of food allergies,
Yeah.
and he told me that one time, he gets a bunch of questions sometimes over the years of people saying, like, "Doesn't that suck that you have all these allergies? Like, considering that most people can eat any, like, tree nut or anything, peanuts?" And he's like, "No, it doesn't bother me because for my entire life, I've had allergies, so I've never known anything different. So it's like there's no issue here. Like, okay, so I can't eat these things. I know that other people can, but you
Yeah.
see what I'm saying? It's like it's not like
You don't have a point of reference in that case.
yeah, he's not unlucky because he has allergies. He was just born like that. And that's just how he
Yeah.
is. And even with luck of predispositions, like having allergies or being born in a wealthy or poor family, it's all about your attitude. I mean, think
Yeah.
about wealth for an example. It's like you're born in a rich family, but you're spoiled and don't really have any values of hard work. So you get out in the real world and you're inexperienced and you fall hard.
Mm-hmm.
Um, or the classic example of the person who was born with nothing and became the ultra millionaire.
Yeah.
That's such a cliche because and it makes sense because when you're poor, you have more of a reason to work for things.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, uh, the reason why the poor person becoming such a super millionaire is it's a cliche, is because it doesn't happen that often. It's talked about a lot. Like, as an
Mhm.
example, like, this guy put in the work, and if you do as well, you can become like him or almost like him. But not necessarily, because
Yeah.
at least it's not a realistic expectation. Because when you're because again, like with allergies, you don't have that point of reference.
Mhm.
Maybe you've been working hard your life, and then you manage to get into college, and then you get a job. You're leagues ahead of your parents at this point, and you're living twice the life you ever had. And then you
Yeah.
become satisfied, maybe. although you're nowhere near the level of the super millionaire.
Yeah, and
That's just as likely. You don't have a point of reference where you could be.
Right. Yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah.
Everybody has a different path. Like the rich person could have an average life or an exceptional life or a rather poor one, or the poor person can stay poor or they can get mild success. Like it's just different for every single person.
Yeah.
And it's all about your actions and your behaviors and your mindsets and your attitudes. Yeah. And these things that are controllable influence the uncontrollable, which is the consequence.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Yeah. Except, again, some people just find themselves in certain situations that predispose them to basically achieve a certain thing. I mean, basically, if you're born rich, it's very rare that you'll die poor. But if you're born poor, it's not likely that you'll die rich.
Yeah.
But it's slightly more likely that you'll, die middle class or you'll die poor. I mean,
you just never know.
Yeah, you're presented with completely different, circumstances, different opportunities.
Right.
It's all it's very difficult to analyze under one perspective.
And it's just so many factors. So yeah, take what I said with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a weird thing to talk about, but I'm also very grateful that you have all these points to kind of go along with it. So anyway, I think we talked about a lot of great stuff with consequences. So what do you think is the big takeaway here?
Well, I'd say that it's you can influence consequences proactively, where if you don't go to sleep by your bedtime, then your mom's going to take your phone away tomorrow. You can deal with consequences like that. But you're also dealing with consequences that already happened, where you're dealing with the fact that you're friends with a certain person and not another, where they're kind of holding you down instead of pushing you up. It's with the consequences, you can deal with them or you can preempt them. It depends on, what kind of person you are and what kind of person you want to be. You can deal with consequences. You can you can turn consequences into rewards, basically, or the other way around, where if you make a mistake and you trip up at your second day of work, this can haunt you. It can, but it could also be a valuable mistake that you made that you can learn from, for the future. When you're senior vice president of the company or on the board of managers, you don't make this mistake,
right?
And you help others to stop them from making it. Where if it's I lost my train of thought. If you if it's the other way around, but if you don't capitalize on this or you don't learn from it, it just will haunt you. You made the mistake and you can't take it back. You can do something about it, but if you don't, the fact is you just made a mistake and you screwed up and it's not going to help you. It's just going to hurt you like you thought it would.
Right. And you can also view it differently. Like if you tripped on the second day, maybe you turn it into a joke. Like maybe you take your flaw of being clumsy and just say, "Hey, I hope I don't trip again," or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's all about attitude too.
Yeah, you can. In that way, you can turn a mistake into, a running joke, which, at that point, you're kind of making everyone laugh at your own expense, but at the same time, you're making yourself come across as approachable, as down to earth, as basically a good person, somebody that a person would want to talk to.
Yeah.
You're putting across a certain image of yourself, and these are maybe intended, but a lot of times there's unintended consequences that go along with decisions like that.
Right. It creates a whole new field of consequences
Mm-hmm.
and a new path to take.
Yeah, and when you're lying in bed regretting what you didn't do 3 years ago, the fact is that it's either so minute that it doesn't matter, it's so massive that nothing else matters,
Yeah.
or but the fact is that these events don't necessarily have that connotation. I mean, you could have you could have been you could have thought you were the best entering, I don't know, a marketing firm, because you went to Princeton and everyone else is usually from University of Kentucky or something like that.
No offense,
So
yeah.
you're yeah, yeah. But it's for the example. So you come in thinking you're better, but then you trip up. You're on a team of 10, but you only emerge as the third best salesman. And, that can define you. Or first, you can temper yourself, understand that just because you went to Harvard or just because, you have a certain advantage doesn't mean that you're better than other people.
Yeah.
And at that point, then you can start to, learn from this mistake. Why don't people want to buy these ball bearings from me? Why? What can I do to increase my sales? What can I do to make myself come across as more friendly, more down to earth?
Yeah.
And that mistake, although it defines you at this point as well, it defines you in a good way. It's the reason that you're now approachable and not, stuck up ass.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, also, I want to add on to that, saying that reputation and everything, basically the consequences that form your present, like from the past that we were talking about throughout this video, it's just interesting because it gives you a vision of what you were in the past. It creates a reputation and a vision of yourself of, okay, so I guess this is what I am and how I'm viewed to people. But even that perception, and we create that perception so we have a grasp of where we are. And it can be helpful because it points out notable flaws that we need to work on, or good traits too. But at the same time, it's also a little destructive because when we classify ourselves as a certain reputation, we often stick with that image that people view us as, and we don't change. When in reality, every single day we're a new version of ourselves and we're always ever changing. And that's part of the reason why we classify things, because we need to have some grasp of certainty in this world. But in reality, we're just ever changing. And to realize that is, I'm not the same shitty guy that I was 2 years ago. And even though I might still have the reputation, starting today, I'm going to work towards what I want to be, having that proactive vision of the future rather than having a horrible vision of the future and then doing things that are apathetic or indifferent that lead yourself to have a negative consequence via the self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
I know a lot, but
it's very important to sum it up. It's very important the way you frame things as a learning opportunity or as a destructive event that
Yep.
you can't, or at least won't, recover from. It's the events obviously they scale. I mean, maybe your family died in a car accident. That's absolutely terrible. Or you tripped over somebody's computer wire on your first day of work, which, destroyed some of their progress on a certain project.
Yeah.
They're on different scales. But from both of them, you can recover. You know, it's not the end of the world.
Right.
You can, you know, less so the car accident, but you can learn from these things. You can maybe not make them positive, but you can make sure that these things don't happen again by, you know, driving more safely, or
right,
trying to, or even lobbying for, you know, some kind of new regulation for safer cars.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there's a lot of outcomes to a certain solution that might not be immediately apparent. You have to move past, you know, your grief or your embarrassment to see the light at the end of the tunnel, but
yeah,
there is a light.
Maybe you are more grateful towards your friends and your connections because of that. Maybe you become Batman. I don't know.
Maybe.
Not to turn that into a joke, but I don't know. Like, there's something to be said about just having a new vision through tragedy.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't have to break us. It
Yeah.
breaks a part of us, but at the end of the day, by acting proactively, we can fill that void with newfound meaning that we never would have had. And maybe that newfound meaning isn't as good as having what we once had. It's a tragedy for a reason. You lose something dear to you that you can never get back. But maybe you'll find something new. And at the end of the day, you just have to move forward.
And life isn't going to wait for you.
Right. And with that said, I think this is a perfect time to close things off. So thanks so much for joining me, Nikita.
My pleasure.
It's been a real fun time talking to you about consequences.
Mm-hmm.
And in consequence, I hope this video does well.
I hope so.
Yeah, I just had to throw in the consequence joke. So with that said, make a difference to your life or someone else's. We're not experts, but we sure have a lot to say. And this has been Culmination about consequences, and I'll end the video now. I'll stop talking. Thanks for listening.